From meetings between world leaders to shaping global governance at the United Nations, China took a multi-pronged approach to diplomacy.
Despite running a divisive campaign, a high-stakes election ended in victory for former U.S. President Donald Trump.
In the U.S. alone, dozens of weather disasters recorded with losses exceeding $1 billion each.
And in Latin America and the Caribbean, tens of millions dealt with the fallout from extreme weather events, with the United Nations calling it a climate emergency.
We look back at the key events that shaped 2024. Hello, and thanks for joining us for CGTN's Year in Review. I'm Mike Walter.
And I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. 2024, a year that may come to be defined by global conflicts, historic elections, and weather extremes. In the waning days of the year, we're taking a look back at some of the major events that helped shape the last 12 months and what we can possibly expect from the new year. As China prepares for 2025, President Xi Jinping is emphasizing the need to strengthen the mechanisms for high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, especially when it comes to the economy.
One region in particular, Latin America, is getting a lot of attention. Last month, Xi attended meetings of global leaders, met one-on-one with heads of state from across Latin America, and highlighted major infrastructure investment. CGTN's Jim Spillman takes a look back.
In Lima, Peru, Chinese President Xi Jinping attended a meeting of the APEC leaders and promoted interconnectivity, free trade, sustainable development, and high-tech innovation.
The world is continuously seeing new uncertainty, and there's quite a bit of protectionist challenges that are, out there. And so I think President Xi's speech spoke quite correctly to working to try to break down those barriers, creating more open economies, and advocating free trade in the Asia-Pacific region.
The Chinese president also took part via video link in the opening of the new Chiangkai megaport. The new $1.3 billion facility, some 80 kilometers north of Lima, was built through China's Belt and Road Initiative and is the biggest deep-water Pacific port in South America. It's expected to cut shipping times to China, boost trade between Latin America and Asia, and create thousands of jobs in Peru each year.
President Xi Jinping's trip to Latin America is of great significance, beginning with the opening of the Chiangkai port, deepening trust between China and Latin America, and marking a new chapter in China-Latin America relations.
President Xi participated in an official state visit with Peru's President Dina Boluarte, held numerous bilateral discussions with Latin American leaders, and met with U.S. President Joe Biden, whose term ends in January. The meetings came after high-level U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, visited Beijing throughout the year. Xi encouraged the U.S. to work with China to properly manage differences and maintain stable China-U.S. relations. In Brazil, Xi attended the G20 summit in Rio and delivered remarks promoting trade, investment, and cooperation to support global development.
The Chinese president is calling for solidarity among developing economies to find win-win cooperation mechanisms, to seek a common backing to gain greater political power in negotiations, to speak with a common voice in front of the developed economies, and overcome the high fences that impede our progress.
Xi wrapped up his South America trip with a state visit hosted by Brazilian President Lula in the capital, Brasilia. A chance to reflect on 50 years of China-Brazil relations while looking ahead to continued strong relations between China and Latin America. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
Multilateralism and cooperation remain key to China's vision at the United Nations. Beijing is leading efforts to ensure global collaboration on artificial intelligence aimed at ensuring developing countries are not left behind in the fast-paced technological space. Jody Jacobs takes a look at China's role at the United Nations this year.
China has continued to assert itself as a key player in international diplomacy, using its permanent seat on the UN Security Council to push for its vision of a multipolar world order. In recent months, China has taken an active role in discussions around key issues, including global security, economic recovery, climate change, and global technology. One of the highlights came in September when Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi delivered a powerful address at the UN General Assembly. His speech emphasized Beijing's commitment to a community of a shared future for mankind, advocating for multilateralism and the protection of national sovereignty.
China opposes all forms of unilateralism and protectionism. We believe that in an increasingly interconnected world, no country can solve global challenges alone. Multilateralism is the only way forward.
As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China has repeatedly used its voice to shape outcomes on key issues such as the conflicts in Syria, Gaza, and Ukraine. In 2024, it has been particularly vocal on the war in Gaza, putting pressure on countries like the United States to accede to a ceasefire, while at the same time urging for dialogue and negotiation in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
China advocates for peaceful resolutions and dialogue. We believe that sanctions only exacerbate tensions, and a lasting solution can only be achieved through negotiation and compromise.
While China maintains its stance on these geopolitical issues, it's a key supporter of the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and has pledged substantial investment in clean energy and green technology. This year, China spearheaded global efforts on AI technology. In July, the UN General Assembly adopted a China-led resolution on international cooperation involving AI development. The measure stressed the importance of supporting developing countries, ensuring no one is left behind.
The international community should respect and safeguard the right of all countries to develop and utilize AI technology on an equal footing, and to work together to create an open, inclusive, and non-discriminatory environment for AI development. AI should be a boon for all, not a game reserved for the rich and the powerful.
One analyst believes that China has certainly played and continues to play a constructive role in ensuring there are no gaps in the rapidly evolving world of technology.
China is certainly making a concerted effort to emerge as a voice of the developing world, but also as an alternative, if you like, to the Western narrative on all things related to the Global Digital Compact, or digital, which has become the catch-all phrase for all the new developments, including artificial intelligence, cyber, quantum, etc. And I think it's fair to say that if you look at the Global Digital Compact, China's role has been quite constructive.
China's diplomatic efforts at the UN will continue to shape the future of multilateralism and international governance. Experts say in 2024 there was a clear emphasis on promoting cooperation, resisting unilateral actions, and balancing its own interests with broader global priorities. Jody Jacobs, CGTN, New York.
And for more now on China's diplomatic engagement in 2024, joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Also with us from Boston is Jorge Heine. He is a former Chilean ambassador to China. Welcome to both of you. Victor, let me start with you. China was heavily engaged in the world this past year. President Xi traveled to Peru for the APEC leaders meeting. He also went on to Brazil for the G20 meetings. How would you sum up China's diplomatic engagement this past year, and especially in trying to achieve its goals like multilateralism?
First of all, the year of 2024 is a year full of conflicts, wars, and uncertainty, and efforts to de-globalize, for example. And China has played a very steady hand in doing its best to stabilize the international relation and contributing to defending peace and defending justice for all mankind. Now, in this way, I think China has played a very crucial role in the world of today, especially in 2024. And when you look at, for example, the Chinese position for ending the war in Ukraine, China's position for protecting the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, and in many other places, as well as China's steadfast commitment to globalization, to developing the economy in a win-win situation, and also promoting lifting people out of poverty in different parts of the world, building up connectivity to enable people to move forward in their economic development. I think China has done much more extraordinary things probably than any other country. And the world needs such great contribution from China in politics, in geopolitics, in safeguarding peace and stability for mankind as a whole.
Ambassador Heine, I mentioned President Xi's visit to Peru for the APEC leaders meeting. It was also a state visit to Peru, and he joined President Dina Boluarte in Peru in opening the megaport, the Chinese-built megaport in Shanghai. What is your assessment of the growing relationship between China and Latin America, and how much of a game changer will this megaport be for trade and trade relations between China and Latin America?
Well, I will say this. China's relations with Latin America have been marked by China's emphasis on development as the driving issue. And in that sense, the port of Shanghai, that will have a very significant impact on trans-Pacific trade. It will cut the time it takes for a ship to get from South America to China to Asia by about 10 days. It will create 8,000 permanent jobs in Shanghai port, and it will bring something like $4 billion in additional income to Peru. It may also lead to the creation, finally, of the bi-oceanic corridors, meaning the corridors from the Atlantic to the Pacific, as Brazil is very keen in getting its own goods that it wants to export to China from its own hinterland. So I would underscore the significance of this $3.6 billion project, of which about half has been spent so far for the future of trans-Pacific trade. But in addition to that, investment has also been very significant. Chinese investment in Latin America, starting with investment in commodities, in oil, in copper, and other metals, also in agriculture, but now shifting to infrastructure in things like the port in Shanghai, but not just heavy infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but now moving to digital infrastructure, which in the current digital age is also very important. And the role of Huawei, the giant telecom company, in that sense, across Latin America, is very important.
Victor Gao, China was also heavily engaged at the United Nations. It played a very important role in calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, where more than 45,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli troops. Thousands more have been wounded, and millions have been displaced in that occupied territory. What can you tell us about China's role at the United Nations in pushing very hard for a peaceful resolution of these kinds of conflicts, and also calling for dialogue?
I'm personally very much amazed by the extraordinary role China has played at the United Nations, both at the General Assembly as well as the Security Council, in doing the right thing to urge for justice for the Palestinian people. And this position is in sharp contrast compared with the position of some other major country at the United Nations and at the United Nations Security Council. Now, what China is doing is calling for legitimate rights and interests of the Palestinian people need to be protected, two-state solution need to be established, and the border for the Palestinian state need to be restored to that of 1967, and Eastern Jerusalem should be the capital city of the state of Palestine. Now, all these are legitimate calls, and they need to be fully protected by the international community. And China, being a permanent member state of the United Nations Security Council, is doing the right thing, is urging other countries to do the right thing. And the world now sees China as really a guarantor or a protector of the legitimate interests and the rights of the Palestinian people. Now, this is truly extraordinary because the world needs to do the right thing at this critical moment. You mentioned about 45,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed. More than 75% of them are women and children, including many pregnant women. I don't think anyone with decency in the world should ever allow such atrocities being committed to the civilian people in Palestine. And China is doing its part, and I hope China will continue to do that and really assert and protect the legitimate interests of the Palestinian people.
Ambassador Heine, in July, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a China-led resolution on international cooperation involving artificial intelligence development. Now, this is, of course, a technology that is rapidly advancing, and China has expressed its concerns. It's expressed its concerns repeatedly, stressing that no one, especially developing countries, should be left behind. There is the risk, as we've seen previously, of what's called the digital gap, and China is concerned that that this digital gap should not exist. How important is this effort by China for Latin America?
I think it is very important. You allude to the so-called digital gap. Some people refer to it as the digital divide between North and South, between the developed world and the developing world. And it seems to me that AI presents, in that sense, a huge danger. Some studies have been made indicating that by 2030, something like $15 trillion will be added to the global GDP just from AI, and that about 84% of that would go to the United States, China, and Europe. And for Latin America, only about 3%. So this goes to show that we are in the midst of this technological revolution, which has many positive aspects, enhancing productivity, allowing us to do many more things in a shorter period of time. But there's also the danger that this will further increase the gap between North and South. In that sense, China's initiative, it seems to me, is very significant, it's very important. It adds to the fact that China has been putting development at the front and center in its concern, in its relations with the global South. So I hope there is a follow-up on that and that we can make this work and see to it that AI is not just limited to the North, but also trickles down, as it were, with a strong effort and not just by itself, to the South.
Victor, China and the United States began the year by marking the 45th anniversary of diplomatic ties. In fact, President Xi and President Biden met at APEC in Peru. President Xi and President Biden also reaffirmed their commitment to maintaining dialogue and cooperation. Now, as the United States gets ready for the incoming Trump presidency, what are your hopes for the future of the China-US relationship in 2025?
First of all, the reality is that in the world of today, China and the United States are the two largest economies, but equally, if not even more importantly, the two largest and most impactful, most influential countries in the world. And therefore, for China and the United States to get along with each other, try to maximize their cooperation is a must. President-elect Donald Trump even said that if China and the United States cooperate, then there will be no limit to what they can do in the world of today. I think I read this in a very positive way, despite of all the naysayers and all those doom predictions, for example. I'm personally very optimistic about the China-US relations in the coming 4 years. Why? First of all, President-elect Trump says he's not going to launch a war for his presidency, and war should not be an option between China and the United States. And whatever problems there are between China and the United States, we can really talk about it, solve them in peace and negotiation, using diplomacy as the instrument, for example. There are lots of issues between China and the United States, that's for sure. But I think China is not an enemy of the United States. That's the great thing, and the Americans should also realize that, rather than pretend that China is an enemy or a rival or a competitor, for example, in the negative sense of the word. I believe between China and the United States, there is inevitability of peace. Peace is the megatrend, and they need to solve whatever problems there are between them based on peace rather than venturing any war.
Victor Gao, Ambassador Jorge Heine, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In 2024, there was no bigger story in the United States than the race for the White House. As the year began, President Joe Biden was seeking re-election once again, running against 2020 rival Donald Trump.
But the incumbent dropped out of the race in July following a disastrous debate performance and was replaced at the top of the Democratic ticket by his vice president, Kamala Harris. Americans headed to the polls in November, and once the votes were counted, Donald Trump emerged as the winner. The former president will return to the White House in January. The adage that elections are ultimately about the economy may never have been more true. Growth largely outperformed expectations in the U.S. throughout 2024, and the forecast for 2025 is also robust.
But recession chances remain elevated, with some analysts saying inflation and tariffs are likely the biggest risks to economic stability. Owen Fairclough has this report.
This was the year the U.S. inflation crisis ended for policymakers and the central bank.
Inflation has eased substantially.
But not for voters.
Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
Anger about the impact of price rises contributed to Donald Trump's presidential election victory over Kamala Harris on November the 5th.
In many ways, it was a classic case of the headline numbers looking strong, solid economic growth, low unemployment, and inflation largely under control. But voters simply weren't feeling it, especially on the latter. Groceries in the US are now around 25% more expensive than they were 4 years ago. So even though incumbent President Joe Biden and presidential candidate Kamala Harris both touted the benefits of their administration investing around $1 trillion into the economy, Trump's complaints about inflation resonated much more with Republican and swing voters.
Nevertheless, Trump is inheriting an economy in decent shape to launch an agenda that includes tax cuts across the board. But some economists say these breaks will add trillions of dollars to an already enormous national debt. And if those tax breaks are a throwback to Trump's first presidential term, so are trade battles.
The most beautiful word in the dictionary to me is tariff.
The president-elect is promising to hit major trading partners, including Canada, Mexico, the EU and China, with steep duties on their imports into the US, prompting Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to start negotiating with Trump even before the latter is inaugurated.
It was an excellent conversation.
Trump claims these duties will protect American jobs from cheaper overseas competition. But some studies on the impact of tariffs during his first presidency suggest they partially backfired by raising costs for businesses and consumers, if only marginally. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Many of Donald Trump's key political promises centered on the America First slogan.
On the domestic front, he vowed to crack down on illegal immigration and articulated a hard line toward American allies regarding foreign policy. Poppy Imputing has more.
This iconic moment in 2015, ahead of announcing his 2016 presidential run, kicked off a domino effect, setting the stage for Donald Trump, the real estate magnate and reality TV star, becoming the most powerful political figure in the U.S.
We will make America great again. Thank you.
From his New York hotel, Trump Tower, where he promised to make America great again, he ascended to the White House twice. A resounding battle cry to his supporters from his first presidential term, and a key message carrying him to victory last month. A pledge to stop illegal immigration into the United States. Doubling down on persistent messaging that undocumented immigrants are poisoning the fabric of American society, Trump's 2024 campaign rallies invoked the specter of what he called an invasion.
And I'm hereby calling for the death penalty for any migrant that kills an American citizen or a law enforcement officer.
Trump's chief pledge is to spearhead a mass deportation program, threatening to remove up to 11 million unauthorized immigrants living in the U.S. He's threatened to use the military and local law enforcement to detain millions of people, starting with migrants with criminal records and previous removal orders. They number in the thousands. Detention centers are already over capacity. Trump's plan would mean building or leasing new facilities. This would be a huge undertaking that would cost as much as $88 billion, according to immigration experts. Some critics note that not only is the price tag hefty, but that mass deportation would lead to labor shortages in industries like agriculture and construction, which would hit consumer pocketbooks hard.
The reality will hit the government and the new government on day one of what they can do or what they cannot. They may have plans. I don't believe that they will be easy for them to implement anything.
Trump also used his presidential campaign platform to turn his protectionist stance outward, zeroing in on traditional international allies, especially NATO. Echoing a frequent complaint that member countries do not pay their fair share toward defense budgets and threatening to withdraw from the alliance unless they comply. This comes as the Biden administration has continued to strongly back NATO and its support for Ukraine in its conflict with Russia, a conflict Trump claims he could end within 24 hours upon returning to office. Trump has also promised to bring peace to the Middle East. He has close ties to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who continues to wage war on Palestinians in Gaza. Poppy and Puting, CGTN, Washington.
On average, 125 people die in gun-related incidents every single day in the United States. This includes homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths. While the numbers have edged lower in recent years, they remain near the record highs seen during the pandemic.
And violence prevention advocates are growing concerned that President-elect Donald Trump could reverse whatever modest gains have been made when he reclaims the White House next month. Tony Waterman explains.
A cold-blooded, calculated killing on the streets of Midtown Manhattan. The early morning ambush of the United Healthcare CEO caught on camera. Brian Thompson, one of the tens of thousands of Americans to die in gun-related incidents in 2024. But overall, experts say gun violence is down.
There's almost certainly a returning to the historic averages, community violence interruption programs being able to get back online. And then also there has been some repairing of community and police relations.
Data shows that gun-related homicides were down more than 13% nationwide in the first 4 months of 2024 compared to a year earlier, and that the typical summer surge never materialized. But there continue to be outliers, like Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, where firearm-related death rates outpace some conflict zones, like Mexico, Haiti, and Honduras.
Unnecessary.
The persistent pervasiveness of gun-related violence, which remains the leading cause of death in children, prompted the U.S. Surgeon General this year to declare it a national public health crisis for the very first time.
Our failure to address it is a moral crisis. To protect the health and well-being of Americans, especially our children, we must now act.
But many worry the exact opposite could happen after Donald Trump is sworn in as president on January 20th.
It's under siege. Second Amendment is under siege. We will roll back every Biden attack on the Second Amendment starting the minute that Crooked Joe shuffles his way out of the White House.
The incoming president has vowed to sign a nationwide law allowing people with concealed carry permits to take those firearms across state lines, even if those states don't recognize those permits. He's also expected to shutter the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention and roll back measures that have expanded background checks and funding for intervention programs and mental health. Measures experts say are proven to work.
I don't want to be a fear-mongering about this, and my hope is that, you know, some of the effects of the programming and policies that have been working, that maybe local jurisdictions and state-level jurisdictions will continue to invest in those, even if the federal government does not.
Experts say the country could become even more divided around the issue of guns, with Republican states loosening restrictions and Democratic states tightening them wherever they can. A unique American problem with known solutions, but disagreement on how to implement them. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Austin, Texas.
And now to discuss what has been a dramatic year in U.S. politics, we're joined by Frank Sesno. He is a professor with the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, and he's a former CNN Washington bureau chief. Also with us from Florida is Eric Bowling. He is host of the Bowling podcast and show, and with us too is Imani Cheers. She is Associate Professor of Digital Storytelling at George Washington University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Frank, it's been an extraordinary year in U.S. politics, and that's putting it mildly. We had President Biden, who was seeking re-election, dropping out of the race. He was replaced by Kamala Harris. And for a little while, we had the possibility of the first woman being elected president of the United States. But in the end, Donald Trump emerged the victor. How would you sum up the year in politics in the U.S.?
I guess I'd use a word, earthquake. And I think we had an earthquake because we had tectonic plates, some of which you mentioned, shifting under our feet. It's demographics, it's technology, it's inflation, it's immigration, it's all these issues colliding. It's also issues around the world, from the Middle East and the fallout from the war in Gaza, and more recently what's happened in Syria, although that didn't really influence the election, but in a certain way, the region certainly did, to Ukraine and Russia. So what's happened here in this country, this election, is like nothing I've seen, and I've been covering elections here for 4 decades, in terms of the sense that democracy itself was at stake. And the country said, no, not the way you Democrats are screaming about it. And the re-election of Donald Trump, while not a landslide in strict numerical terms, was decisive and clear, with really all segments of the country moving in his direction. So we have had an earthquake, and now we're going to measure the aftershocks. I think what's to come is going to be equally momentous.
Eric, let's stick with the earthquake theme, because former President Trump will be returning as President Trump, but he certainly went through some seismic shifts, a lot of legal challenges, assassination attempts. How did he convince the voters, and how remarkable was this win in your estimation?
All due respect to my esteemed colleague and colleagues, it was an earthquake, yes, and I will call it a landslide. I mean, anytime you win the popular vote, all 7 swing states, 312 electoral college votes, I would call that a landslide, especially when the media was telling you differently right up until election. It was going to be a tight race, and maybe Kamala was going to come out ahead. I think it is all the things that Frank mentioned. It was the economy, 9% inflation. It was the sense that Kamala Harris, well, first, Joe, there was a growing sentiment that the Joe Biden presidency was a failure, whether it was Afghanistan, the crime that was spiking, the illegal immigration that was happening that we all saw, and they were telling us, don't believe your lying eyes, it's not true. Mayorkas saying the border's fine. And there's a growing sense among Americans, like they're telling us one thing, we're seeing something different. And then when it went from Joe Biden's miserable presidency to Kamala Harris, and on several occasions she said, I wouldn't change a thing, meaning telling the voting public, expect 4 more or 8 more years of this if you elect me. And they said no. And the problem is, everyone feels like they didn't see it coming because the media got behind what the White House, the dictate that the White House put out, that it was a close race and that Kamala was going to be the first female president. And Americans saw something completely differently. So it was seismic, it was a landslide, but it was not shocking to me.
Imani, cheers. I want to talk about some of those issues that Eric mentioned, around which this election was decided. Things like the cost of living, inflation, economic issues. Would it have helped in the end if President Biden had dropped out earlier, so that Kamala Harris would have had a chance to explain her beliefs and the direction she wanted to take the country in. And she would, as I've said, would have been the first woman elected president if that had been the case. Also, did she really have much of a chance to differentiate herself from the current president?
Yeah, of course, the Democrats are playing hindsight as 2020, and the reality is if Joe Biden would have, in all fairness, resigned, Kamala Harris would have become president and potentially had some opportunity to differentiate herself, and she didn't. And so, as we all know, and as we saw, when you go lock, stock with a candidate, in particular a very unpopular one, on a variety of issues, it's truly a losing formula. And that's what we saw. The landslide, the earthquake, it was a shift. It was a shift. I think there were many people, in particular in what I like to call the Beltway bubble, who weren't feeling, and again, we're not listening to constituents and to members of the electoral votes who were really talking about issues of inflation. They were talking about issues of crime, not issues of immigrants eating people's cats and dogs, but there was a real issue, and we weren't addressing them here in Washington to the level that a lot of people wanted. And at the same time, when you see everything rising around you, cost of food, cost of gas, and everything except your wages to offset that, you have a lot of frustration. And I think we saw that frustration come out in the polls.
And Frank, just to kind of piggyback off that, was it basically pocketbook issues that kind of drove the electorate this time around? And what does a Trump election mean for the economy in 2025, do you think?
Two big questions. Yes, I think it very much was a pocketbook election. I mean, I like to joke that journalists' best sources are cab drivers or Uber drivers these days, so I'll share one story. A driver I was talking to, an Ethiopian man, now naturalized American citizen, who voted for Donald Trump. Why, I asked? Inflation and immigration, he said. Inflation, he's got 2 kids, everything's so expensive. Immigration, I followed the rules. I came in. Now what we've got at the border is a disaster. Okay, that was Kamala Harris's nightmare. Okay, that sort of thing, and that's what people felt. What does it mean for the economy now? Well, there's sort of a mixed take on this, but Wall Street and the business community right now looking at lower taxes, less regulation, saying that's a good thing. And that will stimulate the economy. But they got to worry about, too, on the other side, what happens with tariffs and potential inflation, and we just don't know where that's all going to go. Fundamentally, it looks bullish right now, but we'll see where it goes, as I say, because a lot of this stuff is unpredictable, and the word unpredictable does apply to Donald Trump and the way he pursues some of these things. But right now, as I say, sort of a bullish outlook.
Eric, we've heard the year in politics being described as an earthquake, and Frank was talking about the aftershocks, which we will now see. One of those aftershocks is Trump's policy on immigration, and he's adopted a very radical policy on immigration. He wants to deport up to 11 million undocumented migrants in this country. He's going to start with people who have criminal records. They're going to be kicked out of the country. And many people during the election told us that this was an important issue for them. They wanted the southern border fixed. Mm-hmm. How contentious an issue is this going to be looking ahead? And when Trump talks about deporting 11 million people, is that realistic?
Excellent question. I think what will happen, again, Donald Trump looks at things like the stock market, the inflation rates as almost his scoreboard of how he's doing. So I think if business professionals come to him and say, you can't deport all 11 million people, he'll use that as a reason not to deport 11 million. I'm friendly with the guy. I know them. I know they're the senior chiefs of staff and all the senior deputy chiefs of staff. I know them all. They will close that border. They will continue the wall that they started the first time around. I think America is at least symbolically going to be happy with that. As far as the deportation happens, I don't think the plan is to deport. I know he says it, and he said it, and people say a lot of things. He also said that the war in Ukraine would be over if they just elected Trump before he swore in. But I think if the business leaders come and say, you can't take 11 million, basically inexpensive laborers out of our economy, it'll cost us too much, you'll drive inflation up. He probably won't do it, and he'll use that as the reason why not to do it. But I think he means business as far as the illegals who've committed crimes here. They're gone. They're going to go away whether they have families here or not. they mean business when it comes to the, as Trump called it the first time around, the bad hombres. I don't see 11 million people. I could be wrong, but I don't see the 11 million people leaving.
Amani, whenever you see a change in administration, Republican from Democrat, there's this pendulum swing. And some of the areas where we are likely to see some of those changes might be gun legislation, climate change. I mean, how do you see this next year in terms of the type of changes we're likely to see? And will it be a transformative term for Trump?
Well, I definitely know that we're going to see a lot of our environmental regulations that were repealed during the first Trump administration put back with the Biden-Harris administration, and then they're going to be repealed again. And so that is obviously devastating for a number of environmentalists and those like myself who are just very concerned about the way we as human beings in particular are treating our planet, and of course the way that the United States leads globally in our environmental protection policies. So that we're going to see a major shift. Are we going to possibly see things like the EPA, being defunded? I've heard rumors of that. I don't think that's necessarily where we're going, but I do think there are going to be a lot of regulation rollbacks that are going to definitely play a role in how we lead globally in protecting the planet. I also, as you mentioned, something like gun control. I mean, this is what we like to call common sense gun reform has been an issue that has plagued both Democrats and Republican regimes, dare I say, for well over the last 20 years. I can think back to when I was, just graduated high school and Columbine happened in 1999, and how, we've been having this conversation for over 25 years about how do we really address, sensible gun laws. And I think we're going to still see, unfortunately, policies stuck, especially with the fact that that the Republicans now control all three forms of government, as well as the Supreme Court. And so that's also going to be something for those who, everyone from Sandy Hook, that promise, and those individuals who are still reeling from that massacre to the everyday gun violence that we have right now. And so unfortunately, I think we're still going to see this country loves its guns, but sensible gun reform, I don't think we're going to see any sort of real significant movement in the next administration.
Right, Frank, if we look at the election, I mean, it gave us another clear picture of where the country stands politically. It is split 50-50. And Republicans now also have control of Congress. So what are the prospects of Trump being able to work with Democrats to get some of his program moving? I mean, he's already talking about working with Democrats to get some reform on immigration. But do you think he can get it done, or we're going to see more gridlock?
That's a really interesting question, and I think there may be surprises ahead. I think when Trump came in the first time, the Democrats went into full resistance mode, and they controlled some of the levers on the Hill. And as Imani points out, the Republicans control both houses of Congress now. They didn't before, so there was one investigation after another and two impeachments. That's not going to happen now. And the Democrats are going to calculate that they need to show that they can govern, at least at some level, but they're also going to want to stand in resistance at others. So where they choose to hold hands is one of the big question marks here. I think there's a very good chance that they could do something around immigration like they did last time under Biden, only now it happens under Trump, and he claims victory. As long as the Democrats can brag about something coming out of that, there's potential. There are big questions about funding the government. We're coming to another shutdown moment. There are real budget issues that are going to have to be addressed. So there are going to be places where they have to work across the aisle, or we're going to see very dire consequences that will send strong signals around the world and shut things down here at home. How far they go and how much the Democrats want to collaborate or cooperate, I think, is a big question. But this is a different Trump administration, Trump 2.0, and the dynamic in Washington is different, and the message to politicians was different. So we're going to see some different outcomes as a result.
Okay, and that's where we will leave it. Frank says no. Imani, cheers. Eric Bowling, thanks to all of you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
In 2024, the urgent need for global climate action only intensified. Rainfall was heavier, droughts longer, and heat waves hotter. Edis Johnson takes a look back at the year in extreme weather and how world leaders responded.
Average global temperatures this year indicate 2024 will be the hottest on record, according to the World Meteorological Organization.
If we look at the past year and a half, so that November 2024 is the 16-month and 17-month that we are above 1.5.
That's the threshold established by the Paris Climate Agreement that's already set to be breached much sooner than scientists expected.
The oceans have been warming and absorbing a lot of the excess heat. So we have that component that not only is rapid intensification more likely, but storms are more likely to reach a higher intensity.
The hurricane season started out strong with Hurricane Beryl on July 1st, becoming the earliest Category 5 storm ever seen in the Atlantic. This year's hurricane season was unprecedented in many ways, with a total of 11 hurricanes, well above the annual average. Hurricane Milton became one of the strongest hurricanes to ever hit the Gulf of Mexico, with wind speeds reaching 290 kilometers an hour. That's 180 miles per hour. Just weeks later, Hurricane Helene caused catastrophic damage across several states, including North Carolina, and is the deadliest storm to hit the U.S. mainland since Katrina. South America wasn't spared either. In Brazil, massive wildfires in the Amazon region ravaged ecosystems, while Argentina and Chile suffered from severe droughts, crippling agricultural production and threatening food supplies. To address the global climate crises, countries gathered at COP29 summit in Azerbaijan and agreed on an annual finance target of $300 billion to help poorer countries, drawing criticism from several developing nations.
That the developing country is saying that it's taking the lead with $300 billion till 2035 is a joke. And it's not something we should take lightly. I do not think it's something we should clap our hands and force us to take it.
Developed countries had previously committed to providing $100 billion a year in climate finance for poorer nations. That goal has been surpassed, but the climate crisis is not going away. It is Tian Shan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
And for more now on this record-breaking year in climate, joining us from Phoenix is Michael Dorsey. He is Chair and Director of Sustainability Solutions Service and Professor with the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. Also with us from Phoenix is Mohammed Mahmoud. He is a water management and climate adaptation expert. And from Beijing, we're also joined by Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Taihua Institute and chairman of Asian Narratives. Welcome all of you to the broadcast. Michael, let me start with you. It's the hottest year on record. I mean, we saw everything from really extreme hurricanes, flooding, droughts, you name it. What does that tell us about 2024, and what does it tell us about 2025 as we enter this new year?
Look, the World Meteorological Organization, Mike, has told us that 2024 is on course to be one of the hottest years on record, as you just said. That means that really the climate crisis is speedily moving ahead, unchecked, and we've got to get out in front of it. We've got to get out in front of it to reduce, certainly, carbon emissions. We've got to get out in front of it to reduce the catastrophic downsides for those on the margins. The poorest of the poor, they are least responsible for this crisis, but they bear the unfortunate brunt of it. They see their livelihoods devastated from many wildfire events and catastrophic weather events. So really the harm is to those on the margins, and really those that are driving the problem, those in the wealthiest countries like the United States, those that are at the top echelons, the 1% of the 1%, as it were, like the incoming president, they are driving this crisis by not providing the solutions that we need so urgently to get out ahead of the unfolding crisis.
And Mohammed, as we talk about this unfolding crisis, there's so many different elements to it. Of course, ocean temperatures rising, that means the polar ice caps being impacted, coastal communities seeing rising sea levels. So give us an idea of just how bad a problem that is, and what does that bode for 2025 as well?
You know, one thing to put into perspective is the oceans traditionally act as temperature regulators, right? The oceans absorb heat and help to sort of minimize the impact of warming. But what we're seeing is this very important temperature regulating body is overtaxed because of all this heat and warming that is being absorbed, translating into very, very dangerous consequences. Of course, we talk about the slow sea level rise, encroachment onto land, but we're seeing much more pronounced impacts at a shorter time scale. A lot of this warming is translating into cyclonic and hurricane activity all around the world, and we know how dangerous that can be in terms of damage to infrastructure, flooding, loss of life. But also, when you look at what's happening below the surface of those waters, the impact is also quite severe when we think of all the marine life, coral reefs, fishes, and so forth. And one of the consequences to that also translates to food security and socioeconomic impacts is communities and coastal communities and island nations that depend on fish, livestock to boost their food supply and their regional economies are seeing those populations dwindle and decline because they cannot survive. Many fish species cannot survive at these elevated temperatures or simply migrate elsewhere. So it is impacting, the warming of the ocean is impacting multiple areas for multiple communities.
And Einar, Michael and Mohammed have really kind of set the table for us to my next question, which is, of course, no one's immune from this. And China certainly saw a lot of major events. We talk about cyclones. Of course, it's dealt with that, major flooding. How badly impacted was China in 2024?
Well, like nations around the world, there are many efforts, many impacts that are going on. We obviously saw the news about, the major storms that swept across southern China, but not mentioned is the fact that there are very arid areas in the north which are lacking water. So you're seeing this kind of topsy-turvy turmoil where areas are getting too much water and others are not. Now, you've heard the problem, you've heard that there needs to be solutions. And this is where China is really shining, is that they're providing the technology in wind, solar, and nuclear to power a better future that's going forward. Yes, China still has coal plants, but the fact is they are making sure that the ones that they have are as efficient as possible as they transition more to gas and away from fossil fuels. Already, half the cars in China are electric vehicles, which are really helping the footprint, especially in urban communities.
Yeah, I was just in China. You see green license plates everywhere. Michael, let's talk about biodiversity and habitat, because those are two other very important issues. Of course, when we think about habitat, we think about the Amazon. It's the lungs of the world, as they say. But again, beset with fires this year, and biodiversity. Of course, we had the conference in Colombia at the end of the year. So where do those two stack up as we enter 2025, would you say?
So we know that biodiversity and climate change are interconnected. They're quite linked. So as the climate crisis unfolds and damages ecosystems as well as human systems across the planet, it has deleterious effects on biodiversity. We've never seen as many species at risk as we have in the past decade, and that problem is worsening. The number of species that we're losing year on year is worsening. The threats that those species face because of the damaged ecosystems that they live in is adding sort of pain to the crisis, as it were. So if we're going to get out ahead of the climate crisis, we've also got to get out ahead of the biodiversity crisis, and that's going to require many, many more resources, particularly monetary resources, that we've got to put on the table. Governments have got to come up with those resources to pay for the destruction of biodiversity and to rehabilitate habitats, but also to compensate those that have seen those losses to those ecosystems and going forward. So we've got to put more resources, money and resources to get out of both of these problems, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis.
Mohammed, that leads me to my next question. Of course, we saw COP29. That was the climate conference, the UN climate conference. It took place in Azerbaijan. And, when it comes to this price tag and money, it's always a big issue. And it seems like all of these COPs, whether it's in Azerbaijan or Egypt or Scotland, there's like this mad scramble at the end to come up with some sort of agreement. Happened again this time around, where the wealthy nations said, we'll step up, we'll fund the developing nations at $300 billion. And then you heard a lot of delegates afterwards saying that's simply not enough money. Can you give us an idea of what we're talking about, and how far will that go, and what should be the number that we're looking at?
What's unfortunate is that there were a lot of missteps out of COP29, and this was probably the biggest one when we talk about the finance target. And simply stated, the issue is that the expectation of the funding that should be coming out of COP29 in terms of the agreement and the target are simply not sufficient. And the reason that it's not sufficient is the rate of acceleration of climate impacts and the need to amplify action in terms of mitigation and, in some case, adaptation to deal with the fallout of climate impact as it's ravaging our planet and communities, as we've talked about numerous times. It's just not adequate anymore. And that really led to that stalemate face-off between the developing nations and the developed nations in terms of what is the actual amount that is required. And for many people, what happened, or in some cases didn't happen, deemed COP29 as a failure. I think a larger consequence moving forward is there is now a level of sort of unhealthy distrust between the developing nations and developed nations, because there was strong commitments coming out of COP28. A lot of financial mechanisms were levied forth, and it seemed that, at least in the climate finance space, we were moving in the right direction. But a lot of the things that happened in COP29, certainly as it relates to the climate finance goal, made nations and negotiators feel otherwise. And it almost makes it seem that all these negotiations that happen at the very end of the conference that goes into overtime means nothing if the next year we're still taking a step back in the board, in the writing board and negotiation board, to come to terms to things that the nations have already essentially committed to doing.
So, Einar, I don't want everyone to enter 2025 totally depressed. I want to go back to what you were talking about, a better future. And China really has made enormous strides. I jotted this down because I found this very interesting, that, you know, when it comes to the International Energy Agency, they say China is expected to make up at least half of the world's renewable electricity capacity by 2030. So talk to us about what China's doing and what this means for China's climate goals and its place in the world as far as trying to drive change.
Well, I mean, China is leading by example. I mean, if you want to face the future, there are two essential parts. You heard my fellow panelists talking about the challenges and things like that, but it's technology, and China is stepping up there. We already know with batteries, with solar, with wind, with nuclear, China is leading the world in these areas, and those have to continue. We're not at a place where you can kind of stop. The other one is finance. Without finance, as pointed out, COP29, one figure was $1.3 trillion per year was needed, and the developed world patted themselves on the back because they said, "Oh, we tripled our number to 300 billion." Well, if I tell you the solution is 10,000 and you say, well, I'll give you $100, it's not going a long way towards there. But if things continue apace, if China is able to help countries become nuclear, get off of fossil fuels, this will help the carbon footprint tremendously. So we have to hope, at least for the next 4 years, that China is able to carry the burden, because it's going to be another story coming out of the U.S. Donald Trump has already signaled that he has no interest in climate change, and it's going to be drill, baby, drill. Hopefully that is temporary, and at some point the pressure of climate change will lead to an understanding globally that we're in this together. It's one lifeboat. It's not separate ones.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights. Look forward to chatting with you at the end of 2025, and maybe it'll be all good news then. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us here in Washington. I'm Mike Walter.
And I'm Anand Naidu. Thank you for joining us.